Well, let me just ask you a question. Are you better off than your parents were? How many, just raise your hands if you don't mind. How many of you experienced better lifestyles, better incomes, better things than your parents? Now, and that's about what we see in any audience. But now then, if we ask the question, how many of you think your children are going to be better off than you are? What do we hear? Some think your children are going to be better off. Some think they're not going to be better off. I was studying through the archives of economic stuff, which I really do like, and I stumbled on a curve, a graph there the other day that sort of puts a lot of things in context. And if you don't mind, I'll just draw that curve up here. It's simple, but it'll be one of the key things that we talk about for the rest of the discussion. And so it's a curve like that. It's basically per capita income. It shows through the years that per capita income has been increasing. And in fact, if you read the USA Today, the headline says, is it better than ever? And it shows our incomes to be $40,000 a day, and they were in 1980, $24,000. But it's the conclusion that I think that we have to talk about. It says, are we better off today than before? And it says, absolutely. But tough times have us thinking otherwise. So you and I as policymakers really have to wonder, should we really be concerned about the economic situation that's facing the world and this country? Is it something to be alarmed about or something not? Now this curve shows us the same thing that we're just discussing. Actually, in the last year or two, incomes have peaked out and have started down. So we're basically in that point right there. And if you think your children are not going to be doing quite as well, that's showing up in our gross domestic product, in our per capita incomes. But that's not the amazing part. Graphs have a tendency to go on. I mean, any of you that I slept through that day of math class, so I had to learn this on my own last week, but graphs continue. In other words, these years continue along the x-axis, and yet you see the curve discontinues. Now, this is Office of Management and Budget, the White House, and the CBO. Those are nonpartisan groups that are saying that the curve is discontinuous in 2032. What does that mean? That means that if we don't change our economic track, that our economy simply is not measurable. The failure at that point, 2032, is just not measurable. We cannot continue on the track that we're on indefinitely and expect our children to have even a future. This is what happened to the Soviet Union. They simply collapsed under this economic premise. And we're facing the same things, and no one is talking about it. And I felt like that somebody should be talking about it, and so this is basically the first public discussion of many that we're going to have. Now, how did we get in this situation? It's actually much simpler. And so I'll put a couple of numbers up here. It's actually much simpler than what we believe. The top number, 3.5T, that's what we spend every year. The bottom number is how much we receive to the government. This is the federal government in taxes, 2.2. We're simply spending more than we bring in. It's not that complex. Now, the difference is about 1.3. Now, that 1.3 is what we're calling deficits. It's a deficit this year. But it also is moving into a pipeline, and that pipeline puts it into a pool at the end of the year called debt. And so if you visualize a holding tank at the end of this pipeline that the deficit is in, you have the debt accumulating, and that debt accumulation is what is putting us at risk in the future. So when people tell you that we can go on, when that absolutely, times are tough, but they're livable, I think that we really need to look. Now, our 2.2, now keep in mind the debt barrel has about 15 T in it. So if we were to take everything that we make for the federal government for 7 years with no expenditures, we would pay off the debt, but we would not pay it off before. Except that we're not paying off debt. Instead, the debt barrel is getting more full each year. The deficits continue to pour in. So that actually the deficit for this year has already been told to us a couple of days ago, 1.5 T. So at the end of this year, the debt will be approximately 16.5 T. Now that is alarming enough, but then there's an aquifer of debt that we don't count in Washington because it's too uncomfortable to talk about. And so for me, I draw it down here. The unaccounted for liabilities in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are $202 trillion. We could take everything that the federal government makes for the next 100 years and not pay off the obligations that we have. Now, to me, this means that we as Democrats and we as Republicans, we're going to run for office in our particular parties, but for the near future, this one issue of what to do needs to be set aside, and we need to work as Americans and as New Mexicans to solve the problem. Because if we work at it together, it's going to be difficult. And if we don't find ourselves working at it together, we're going to continue to fight, and we're going to continue to use this as a political tool back and forth. And the discontinuity at 2032 could easily come this way. The question then arises, what do we do about that? And keep in mind this 15T, just to put that in perspective, before President Bush came in was about 5T, so everybody up to President Bush was about 5T. Then President Bush added 5T to it, so he doubled the debt in 8 years, and that people who criticize that are they're on solid ground to criticize that. And under President Obama, the debt then has grown 3.5 in 2 years. It's on track to be 7 during his time. And frankly, I believe it would do the same under a Republican president. So this is not saying, oh, blame Bush and blame Mr. Obama. This is saying we in this country have a very, very difficult situation that is not tenable.